Good afternoon. Thanks for being here. I'm Charles Waldheim. It's my pleasure to serve as the John Irving Professor of Landscape Architecture and co-director with my friend Michael Hayes of the Master in Design Studies program. Thanks all for being here. If you haven't had any food yet, please enjoy. It's a great looking spread. Thanks to Sarah and Matt and the entire team for organizing things. For those of you on the line and listening to this in the future, I'm sorry I don't have anything to offer you, but I'm glad that you're with us either now or in the future. The GSD is located on the traditional and ancestral land of the Massachusetts, the original inhabitants of what is now known as Boston and Cambridge. We pay respect to the people of the Massachusetts tribe, past and present, and we honor the land which remains sacred to the Massachusetts people. The school also recognizes the work of the Harvard University Native American program in cultivating the relationships that led to the creation of this acknowledgement. A quick reminder, we have live captioning available this afternoon for both our virtual and in-person audience members. Those joining virtually can enable captions by clicking the closed captioning icon at the bottom of the live stream window. And for those of you with us here in Stubbins, live captioning is available through the QR code currently on screen. Thank you that it's on the screen. I'm so happy when that happens. If you have any questions, please visit the AV booth at the back. In addition to this afternoon's program, Signe is in town to join us for an event at the Gardner Museum this evening, which is a conversation, 7 p.m., including Sue Mobley of the Monuments Lab and Jadi Amazi from Mass Design Group. And the conversation is about the status of commemoration, collective memory, memorials, statues, and the status of both, authorization and public civic action with respect to those announcements. Please join us. There's still a few seats left at isgm.org. Here in the building, tomorrow, the Doctor of Design Conference will convene 9:30 a.m. in Piper Steps around the topic of real-time nature. This is an annual conference organized by the Doctor of Design students. Please join us. I will be there for several sessions, including the 5 p.m. Introduction of the keynote by Daniel Barber. So we'll look forward to seeing you then. And I'd also like to mention there will be a Senior Loeb Scholar conversation on the topic of building with care with Jermaine Barnes, October 7th, 6:30 p.m. And I believe that's also in Piper? Piper, yeah. So please come out for that. If you haven't yet really appreciated the poster of the GSD's event series, I encourage you to take a look at it. There's some hard copies in the back, and the combination of the print and the digital, I think, is working quite well. So congratulations to the entire communications team. And without further ado, let me introduce you my friend Signe Nielsen. Signe is an extraordinarily talented and well-accomplished, one of the preeminent landscape architects in North America. She's founding principals of Matthews Nielson, and with her colleagues there through her New York office, she's been practicing for over the last 5 decades. She started very young and has made an extraordinary array of important public projects on a variety of fronts. Most recently, you will note that Signe was lead landscape architect in conversation with Thomas Heatherwick and company on the design of Little Island in New York. You'll recall that Little Island is neither little nor actually an island, but maybe more about that in the conversation. In addition to her award-winning practice, which has been premiated and received, published, and exhibited widely. And in addition to being a fellow of the American Society of Landscape Architects, Signe is importantly a teacher. She's taught for many years in urban design and landscape architecture at Pratt, among other places. She also has served in this space, and a part of the conversation we hope to have today, as both a member and also as a former president of the Public Design Commission in the city of New York and its antecedents that had different nomenclature. Now this body, among other things, and Signe will tell you more about it, this body is, among other things, the body responsible for advising on commemorative plaques and statuary and these kinds of things. And given her longstanding role both in building the public realm in New York, but also as a kind of fiduciary responsibility, kind of public servant in a way, I'm sure they weren't paying your day rate for those meetings. Also, at the center of what have now become really quite central conversations about the commemoration of collective memory in the public realm. So thanks for being here. Please welcome Signe Nielsen.
Thank you, everyone. Oops, I got to adjust this down. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to refer to my notes so I can stick to my time, so there's time for your questions. It really is a pleasure and an honor to be here, and thank you, Charles, for that introduction. I'm going to speak about two adjacent topics that share some interesting overlaps, in my opinion. I specifically chose Mount Auburn Cemetery as the background for this intro because it represents a continuous evolution over 200 years in both the notion of cemetery as park and monumentation. Now, I'm going to do a zoom through history. Central Park is certainly one of the first great parks in the United States that typifies, in my opinion, the 19th century paradigm, which I posit to be the intersection of nature, art, and culture. These parks, for the most part, were largely unprogrammed and were designed for strolling and enjoyment of an albeit man-made natural setting for the benefit of urban residents. By the 20th century, as our urban areas grew rapidly, there was increasing demand for active recreation. So even Central Park, shown in the upper left, began to be altered by insertions of ball fields, tennis courts, structured skating rinks that replaced unprogrammed passive landscapes. Other parks, as you see here, built during this century also exhibited a predominance of sports activities with, at best, a thin veneer of landscape. So this significant shift in emphasis from nature to hardscape and all the concomitant fallout in terms of destruction of the urban forest canopy, stormwater runoff, and the urban heat island effect. So, I want to use Little Island, a project for which we were the landscape architects, as Charles said, as an example of perhaps a 21st century alternative that also encapsulates the intersection of art, nature, and culture, but in a contemporary way. The park is just 2.4 acres in size, a peanut compared to Central Park. It replaced a pier, the pile field of which is at the bottom of the photograph, that was destroyed in Hurricane Sandy. The park was privately funded by a single donor for $260 million and designed with minimal public engagement and continues to be maintained by the original donor who finances the landscape maintenance, public services, and all of the artistic programming. The park has a 20-year lease, but operates under the same rules and regulations of the larger Hudson River Park in which it sits. The Heatherwick Studio was the initiator of this concept. Thomas likened the form to a flying carpet. I perhaps, because I am a landscape architect, saw the form and thought of it as a leaf floating in water. I'm going to focus on just these three concepts here. It may seem confusing to pull them apart, but you'll see how they all kind of knit together and support each other and express this notion I have of 21st century attributes of an alternative type of public park. Since Little Island was conceived in the immediate aftermath of the most powerful hurricane in living memory to hit New York City, during which the Esplanade, sort of terra firma, was under 6 feet of water. Therefore, we set an elevation that was 10 feet higher than that to accommodate both future sea level rise and storm surge. Therefore, Little Island is not connected perpendicularly to land, as all the other piers are, but accessed by two sloping walkways you can see sort of on the right side that bring you up to this new base elevation of 16 feet. The tipped-up corners of the southwest and the southeast are not a conceit, but rather a carefully studied strategy to allow the low angles of the morning and afternoon sun to reach under the pier for the benefit of marine habitat. This southwest corner is a full 62 feet above mean river level. Our State Department of Environmental Conservation was highly skeptical that a square pier 3 times wider than a normal pier would cast less shade, but between the tilted corners and the significantly higher elevation than a typical pier, we proved we would not cast more shade and in fact cast less shade. The most impactful environmental forces affecting the landscape of Little Island are wind and extreme temperatures. There is less concern about salt due to the high elevation above the water. So the trees were selected to have small leaves, presenting less mass to the wind, and they are also anchored to the concrete deck with massive steel cable. Other concerns, oh, I like to walk around, but thank you. Oh, sorry, I walk away from the mic, sorry. Okay, right. So they're anchored to the concrete deck with steel cable. This is plural. The other concern was cold from below and the structure that could affect soil temperature. So I selected plants that are one zone colder than New York City, but also tolerant, of course, of heat extremes. And thus far, we have lost no plants to wind or cold or heat stress. The plants are not all native, full disclosure, though there is a high percentage of natives. We decided to test a hypothesis to enhance biological diversity at the genetic, species, and ecosystem levels. We did this by using, for example, 7 different cultivars of panicum, a native grass. This genetic diversity provides the basis for populations to respond and adapt to environmental uncertainty. It will take some years to see if this hypothesis proves itself, but we have the space, and I love panicum. Here you see the native grasses over the course of 6 months, from July through December, backed by the evergreens that buffer the north wind and also provide excellent habitat for birds. And this also gives you the sense that throughout the park, the colors evolve and change regularly, continuously. Oops. This is dizzying. In addition to ensuring multi-seasonal color and interest, a major goal was to promote habitat for pollinators and birds, which need food for, and nesting, both tree and ground, and shelter. We learned that certain species of bees, for example, need 6 different plants blooming simultaneously for them to have enough to feed on, and enough kind of variety. You know, you get really sick of eating empanadas all day long. So we mapped the duration of bloom, as well as seed production time for the grasses, as well as berry production on the evergreens, that would be the junipers, and the berry-producing shrubs. And this chart, by the way, of course you can't read anything, and I don't mind, only represents 1 quadrant of the 4 of the plant material in Little Island. Yes, I went a tad crazy. What one designs and what actually happens is not always predictable. But here we have evidence of monarchs and their pupae, a native praying mantis, a nesting duck. We now have 4 pairs nesting, a resident red-tailed hawk, and a migratory bird. I have noticed such creatures visiting, I've noticed more such creatures visiting the landscape every year. So this, of course, for me is incredibly gratifying because I intended for the, literally the birds and the bees, but I had no idea I'd get hawks and praying mantis and all sorts of other, and not a lot of rats, by the way, either. In fact, very few. Okay, this is a little dim, but that's somewhat intentional. we were able to persuade the client team, and by that I really mean the Hudson River Park Trust, who's a city and state agency, to reduce normal public park lighting levels by directing light down onto the paths and stairs rather than just sort of a uniform distribution throughout. So the light levels comport with dark sky guidelines, as do the fixtures, and really create a sublime experience. And P.S., I take zero credit for this. The lighting designers were Fisher Morant Stone. Now, this was an unintentional piece of kind of good news at the end, I guess. We did not intend at the outset of construction, but as it happened, the vast majority of materials were either fabricated or procured from the New York area, including the concrete pots, stone, and black locust. Okay, I'm going to be a good girl here, and I'm going to use this. Okay, these here were cast in a plant just north of Albany. When we went up to visit the plant, just a quick story, we went up to visit the plant where we were in a van, a bunch of us, and we looked out, and it's a vast space. We looked out on either side of us, and one side were concrete caskets, and on the other side were concrete catch basins. We thought, these guys can do architectural concrete? Really? But they learned. And they hired a bunch of really fantastic engineers from RPI, and they figured out how to cast them. So they were cast in pieces here, and then they were assembled into these 5-petal forms just south of Albany, and then they were barged down the river. This was the coolest thing to see. It was so cool. So then here they are, 1, 2, 3, 4 per barge. And then this is when they were hanging out at the port of Coyman in upstate New York. Then when they got to Little Island, there was an enormous crane that would pick them up and then lower them in one unit onto the piles. Now, beyond environmental sustainability, we also consider people as part of this equation, offering a place for physical and mental wellness through solace and stress-reducing activities is very much a component of human resilience. Whether exercising, playing, painting, talking with a friend, these are all moments when people gather their thoughts, enjoy the out of doors, and maybe even the special beauty of Little Island. Now, moving on to the art, or perhaps we should call it artistry, part of the chapter here, which I will describe as a choreographed visual experience. The circulation system is a combination of universally accessible paths that take the visitor to each of the high points and other destinations. And then there's an addition of stairs that provide both shortcuts and alternative routes. This dual system, which looks remarkably like the game of Chutes and Ladders there on the right, helps reduce crowding and offers visitors more opportunities to experience and engage with the landscape. There's more than half a mile. Remember, this is only a 2.5 acre park. There's more than a half a mile of path length and 1,900 stairs for those early morning Stairmaster enthusiasts. Okay, full disclosure. I was a professional ballet dancer in my early career, and the notion of choreography occurred to me because of these extreme path lengths and frequent switchbacks. So how to make this actually enjoyable? So I thought about what the site offered, both borrowed scenery in terms of the river and the skyline, and the proximate views that we could control. So some paths, particularly at the mid-level elevations, lead your eye toward the inward-facing or controllable views, while others offer glimpses of the surrounding urban context, a mix of, if you will, of foreground and background. While others give you a framed view of the river, proximate and borrowed scenery. So these are snapshots. I haven't figured out how to embed video yet. These are snapshots of a sequence, clockwise from top left, that takes one up to the highest point, which is intentionally obscured by tall grasses, if you're confused, on the lower left. I believe in a revelatory experience, so that there's some level of anticipation and surprise. And there you are, 62 feet above the water, with expansive views to the Hudson River's outer harbor, Statue of Liberty, Manhattan and Jersey City skylines, and no plants here to distract you. This is the go-to selfie spot. The choreography of the circulation, combined with the ever-changing topography, invites multiple perspectives. This gives you a good sense of that sequence I just showed you, going to the southwest overlook. You can see the delicate balance of path layout, the plant bed widths to create sufficient visual separation, and the significant retaining walls. Please hold. Significant retaining walls. And also pot breaks, but these are like 12 feet tall. And slopes that achieve this 46-foot elevation change in less than 150 feet. How many of you can do grading? Never mind, I won't ask. Not to mention the fantastic fall color. I spend a lot of time watching people, and I've observed that people tend to look down when they're going uphill because they may not be able to see their destination, or are unsure of their footing on stairs, and are leaning forward with their heads generally tilted downwards. But by contrast, when they're descending, or about to descend, they tend to look out and beyond to take in the view and their immediate destination. So these two observations resulted in us calibrating the level of intricacy in the planting diversity close to the paths to correspond with people's innate visual tendencies. So more complex, lots of like matrix planting, approximate to the paths, and more swaths or drifts beyond. As the plan showed, all paths lead somewhere. And so this destination is the Glade, a small performance and impromptu gathering area I'll speak a bit more about later. There are also places to pause just off the path proper and nestled into the landscape. I'll just note that the paths are consistently 8 feet wide, so all benches had to be located off the paths into the landscape to avoid pinch points. Okay, we're moving on to culture. This is perhaps the most tangible manifestation of a distinguishing characteristic of this 21st century park. I believe there are many examples of 19th century parks that are expressive of nature, but not in the way we now interpret nature as needing to be performative as well as beautiful. I would hope that the performative aspects of the landscape are intrinsic to the design and don't scream out, "Hey, look at me, I'm doing good." And I think that there are many 19th century parks that are considered art through choreography in how paths were aligned and views were calibrated. And culture in a 19th century park was deeply reflective of the societal and artistic norms through sculptural monuments to significant people in the arts, as well as politicians and soldiers and whatnot, and other manifestations of our culture. The donor's brief to Heatherwick was to create a park for different kinds of performances. That was the basis behind designing the pier as a square rather than as a rectangle. The square is 320 feet by 320 feet, and combined with topography allows 2 of 3 venues, 1, 2, 3 venues, to perform simultaneously because of the sound buffering created by the landforms. The lawns are also sloped to provide overflow seating for both the playground and the glade. I do need to point out that the size of the playground is based on the turning radius of a fire truck, not audience capacity. There's a lot of technical things in this period. The amphitheater is tucked into a large landform, and the glade is actually buffered by, again, another one of these gigantic 12-foot high retaining walls. Where was I? And from the outset, both the donor and the not-for-profit organization that he funds and he started, Little Island, it's called littleisland.org, set about to instill diversity, equity, and inclusion in all of their public-facing interactions. I believe that's the 21st century part of the story here. The first performance after the park opened in May 2021. It was a musical composition by the artist in residence, the gentleman in the green suit in the front here. The performance set a bar for producing events that attract a broad audience, racially, culturally, generationally, and by sexual orientation. In 2023, during Pride Month, this lively cabaret performance was a true celebration of diversity. This year, Little Island commissioned 9 original pieces of music, dance, and theater. This premiere performance by Twyla Tharp kicked off the 2024 season. Again, to point out that all of these works were sponsored, paid for by the donor, who also pays for the production staff at Little Island. But what happens with this 750-seat amphitheater when there are no performances? Too much real estate in this small park to be left partially unused. So, in fact, it is very well used. People watch the sunset, they can watch rehearsals, teching of productions, and even stage a group photo. This is the smallest. I told you we'd come back to the Glade. It's the smallest performance venue that seats about 60 on the timber treads. Programming here is always free and is generally geared toward young children and seniors. They offer yoga, lectures, and various kinds of educational programming. And the landscape, interestingly, has become a very important part of that educational programming, and I work very closely with the person who does that programming. I also want to point out the Teen Night poster here. Photographs are not permitted. Not permitted at Teen Night, which is a venue for unhoused teens, often with many other challenges. This is their opportunity to express themselves unchoreographed by Little Island. And they come from an organization called The Door, and The Door is in very close proximity to Little Island. So what happens in this vast open space that fire trucks never come to? Again, all free activities, many of which are conducted during lunch and early evening. You see local school kids doing classwork, using Little Island's landscape as a living laboratory, salsa classes and musicians all doing their thing and encouraging folks to join in as they wish. And throughout the park are a number of portable musical elements, except the dance chimes, which are embedded. And these move around the park on a regular basis and are there for one and all to engage as the spirit moves them. So this is truly, in my mind, a place for all people, neighbors, New Yorkers, and tourists. Little Island has tried to embed diversity in all that they do, including through their internships, staff hiring policies, artists in residence, and discount tickets, and as you saw, intentionally broad programming offerings. So I offer you this summary. This is not a paradigm for the future. It cannot replace active recreation needs. But perhaps it does offer an alternative to the 20th century model that prioritizes sports, pavement, and veneer landscape over productive landscapes. Little Island is a place where nature is conceived both as beautiful and performative, where art is in the eyes of the beholder and culture is for all. The park doesn't tell you what to do or where to go. It's a pick-your-own-adventure design in which nature, art, and culture are integral components of the greater whole. But wait, there's more. Controversial monuments. How am I doing on time? Okay. This is only like about 10 minutes. Okay. So first, a little backstory, which Charles already kind of alluded to, or actually spoke about directly. I served as commissioner and then later as president of the New York City Public Design Commission from 2006 to whatever it was, 2022. The commission was created in 1896 to oversee all existing and new public works of art. No monument, sculpture, or memorial can be altered, relocated, erected, or deaccessioned in New York City without approval of the Design Commission. So for 19 years where I served, I had to act on the following issues, among many others. Oopsie, sorry. Many issues. In 2017, the then mayor of New York, we're about to lose another one, convened an august panel of experts, partially in response to challenges in southern states to remove statues of heroes and symbols of the Confederacy, and partly by New York residents who took vociferous exception to a number of public statues in our city. The panel was charged with defining the why. As a nation, we are grappling with how, as a society, we have represented or misrepresented our history and our current collective values. The what is that certain of our monuments are lacking in inclusivity and robust historical understanding, and as a result, exclude the complexity of the narratives and fail to reckon with the power to represent history in public. And the how was the panel's set of guidelines that set forth a number of strategies to deal with controversial monuments. But remember, the buck stops at the Design Commission, for better or worse. So let me provide some examples. Marion Sims was a gynecologist who was credited with positive advances in women's health care. However, what the narrative fails to portray is that he used enslaved black women without the benefit of anesthesia to conduct his experiments. There were some very angry people who not only wanted his statue removed, they wanted it melted down. But as president of the commission, I was obligated to find a compromise because we are not able to destroy public art. Our decision was to relocate his statue to Greenwood Cemetery, where he is buried. No replacement has been put in this location prominently on the edge of Central Park on Fifth Avenue. So obviously in all of the subsequent images, you'll see the before and then the after on the right. Erected in 1925, the statue of Theodore Roosevelt graced the entrance to the Museum of Natural History. The statue depicts Roosevelt high on his horse with two naked, diminutive figures of a Native American and a black man on either side. This is clearly a manifestation of communicating racial hierarchy, as well as Roosevelt's views on race and support for the eugenics movement. The Design Commission voted unanimously for its removal and long-term loan, not deaccession, to the Roosevelt family, who will reinstall it in North Dakota as goodbye. As part of the Theodore Roosevelt Memorial Library, which I bet you didn't know is being designed, that's going to open in 2026. Rush right out there, people. Okay. This statue of Thomas Jefferson was donated to the city of New York in 1834, in other words, before the commission even existed, and therefore became the commission's responsibility. The statue stood, as you can see here, on a pedestal overlooking the members of the city council. During the commission's hearing on this piece, members of the City Council, who now represent more than 50% people of color, testified to have the statue removed. I quote one councilperson's testimony. "I cannot sit in the presence of a statue that pays homage to a slaveholder who fundamentally believed that people who looked like me were inherently inferior, lacking intelligence, and were not worthy of their freedom or rights." Again, we voted unanimously for the removal from the council chamber. But where to put him? So after some negotiation, the New York City Historical Society agreed to put the statue in their public library. See, if we move a piece, it has to go to a public place. It can't go into somebody's closet or some private residence or something like that. It has to remain in the public domain. So the New York Historical Society has a public library, which actually is visited by 200,000 school kids a year, which is great. And it's accompanied by a narrative and more information that tells the buried story. That was also on my watch, and I just want to say I received numerous death threats for being anti-American. There are multiple other examples of controversial monuments, such as Christopher Columbus, one in Central Park, one at Columbus Circle. In such cases, the decision has been made to provide alternative narratives through supplemental statues and plaques to fill in the missing history or overlooked or buried, shoved under the rug history. Okay. But not all monuments are controversial because of their intentional or otherwise misrepresentation of history. The Tilted Ark by Richard Serra, it's a little hard to see, but it's that there, was commissioned by the federal government in 1981. Serra's intent was to raise awareness about space and movement. But in just 1984, a federal hearing was held, and the jury ruled, a four-person jury, ruled the piece interfered with the public's enjoyment of this gorgeous plaza. And the piece was dismantled and put in storage where it remains today. This situation raises fundamental questions about the role of government funding for the arts, artists' right to their work, the role of the public in determining the value of a work of art, and as a corollary, whether public art should be judged by its popularity. Heavy questions. Okay, almost at the end. Maya Lin's Vietnam Memorial transformed the arc of memorial design. She set the standard for distinctly minimal, sublime, cathartic, therapeutic, and intricately symbolic memorialization. Yet just 2 years after it was completed in 1982, a number of elected officials, largely members of the House of Representatives, said the memorial spoke to shame and horror rather than to the human spirit. This criticism led to the erection of a statue of these three soldiers. There's also a flag, and now there's another one, but whatever. According to the sculptor, this addition represented the face of human sacrifice and the bonds among soldiers. Maya Lin opposed this intrusion vociferously, but to no avail. So I sort of posit the same questions as I did from Richard Serra for this as well. So I'm going to conclude with this. It's a temporary World War I memorial in a London park. It speaks to a massively bloody war and the poppy fields that grew over the trenches. It is poetic and beautiful. So where does this leave us in terms of me trying to weave together a 20th century park and controversial monuments? What is the role of public or civic engagement in design and or selection and then removal of some monuments? In some ways, parks escape the threat of removal by having to be refurbished or redesigned after some years of heavy use and are protected as mapped parkland. At least the land is protected by the state legislature. But one can always redesign them to fit a contemporary perspective or standard. But that's not the case for monuments or artistic pieces. Creative and commemorative works reflect the values of the time that they were conceived and built, and the priorities of the entities that funded them. When have we crossed the line between obliterating or obscuring history and expressing a point of view? In 10 or 20 years, will Little Island feel like an outdated folly? That will be a tough one to redesign, but perhaps it will collapse into the river first. What endures and why should something endure? Societal values continue to shift, history will continue to reveal obscured narratives, and cultural debates will continue to rage over appropriate choices of the moment. When these shifts occur, do we destroy or remake or retell our past? You are the next generation of leaders, and you will have to continuously educate yourselves to make these difficult but informed decisions. Thank you for listening, and Charles and I are happy to take any questions. Or Charles will moderate and I'll answer whatever.
Thanks, Signe. That was great. We're going to spend most of our time together over the next few minutes hearing from you and getting your questions. I'll kind of open up. But thank you, Signe, for being here. I know that meant you got on a train very early this morning, but it's nice to see you back here, and thank you for sharing that. And it's also kind of you to share in equal measure both your own creative work through the design firm, but also your role as a kind of public servant. I find these two things obviously informing one another. We've seen in recent years, you've alluded to it, in addition to the kinds of conversations you've had with your colleagues in New York, we've also seen instances of, let's call it, direct civic action. Civic action is a formulation I learned from Alex Wall, my friend, and I now use it regularly. So in places like Richmond, Virginia, on Monument Avenue, or in Bristol, England, or in Toronto, Canada, they didn't wait for the deliberation of the publicly responsible body. And I wonder if you have either experiences about that kind of direct civic engagement that precludes or preempts deliberation, and also, like, how might we think about the relationship between that kind of direct civic action and the kinds of, deliberative and consultative kind of review processes that you've been a part of?
Well, I guess I would say that graffiti is probably a form of action. And so if a piece is not welcome, it's tagged. It may be defaced as well. But I actually, it's interesting because, so this report that the panel produced for the mayor, I think they looked at 100 different monuments, and then they kind of categorized them by sort of priority of action. And the ones I showed you, those first three, were the highest priority, and we acted on them, I would say, within a year, year and a half. On my watch at the Design Commission, we also approved probably 30 new works of public art in the city of New York. Some are abstract, a few are representational. One of the most challenging representational ones was supposed to be for the women's suffrage movement. There apparently is no statue of a woman in Central Park except for Alice in Wonderland. So this was going to be the first statue to women, or a woman, it wasn't clear at the beginning, on the mall, where that big lineup of men is. And that became one of the most controversial debates about how to be inclusive in that monument. And at the end of the day, we changed it from being a woman's suffrage memorial to just these three women who were involved in it. But you can go visit it today. It's very overwrought. It's it's like got the narrative just sort of spewing out in front of it. You know, there's reams of paper, and it's a.
So you're a big fan, I can tell.
But it was sponsored by the granddaughter of whomever. Susan. I don't remember her name now. Blocked it out. What? Susan Anthony? No. Yes, I think so. Anyway, it was. I didn't realize how difficult it was to actually work with an artist that was being overseen by a client, in this case, this organization of women. Oh my goodness, it was really tough. It was really tough.
Speaking of clients, are there works of public art within or atop Little Island?
There are just goofy things. There are 2 whirligigs, but they're manufactured by a German play equipment company, and they're temporary. Barry, that's the donor's name, I just spilled it out. He's considering, never would he put permanent art in there, but he is thinking about temporary installations.
Sure, yeah. I mean, we're here in the Stubbins room. I'm the Irving professor. Of course, I noticed that Little Island is not Barry's Island. I mean, it's Barry's Island, but it's also, not named that way. And we're in the midst here in a conversation on this campus, I think as many campuses are, about naming, right? On the one hand, we used to have the Philip Johnson Thesis House. Now we have 9 Ash Street, for example, right? And so I would imagine that place names come into the conversation as well for your group, or was that a different group?
Well, for the 8 years I worked on the project, we called it Pier 55 because it was Pier 55. It was the pier that. And then all of a sudden, one day, we got this hideous logo, and someone said it was being called, because we had to draw it. That's right, we had to draw it so it could be engraved on the pier marker. Its name was being changed to Little Island. But there was a lot of negative press. I was saying to Sarah before the park opened, and there was. I remember. I never forget a headline in the Daily News: Diller Island. And I think that some of the negativity was the concern that because it was a $260 million donation, that like a lot of buildings and hospital wings and whatever, it was going to be called, the Diller von Furstenberg Island. But Barry is truly a very modest man, and the only place his name shows up, and my name is there too, and other people's names are there too, is a manhole in the middle of the turning radius of the fire truck. That's it. That's the only place you would see his name.
Can anybody give me the gender-neutral term for manhole? I'll wait. Maybe we have some questions from the audience. What's on your mind? Yeah, over here. There's a microphone coming to you for our folks that are on the line.
Oh, someone just said it. Someone said access hole.
Access hole. I teach grading and drainage, so there we go.
Hi, I'm Hannah. I'm a first-year urban planning student, and I lived in New York before moving up here, so it was really lovely hearing you speak. I guess I have a question because I've spent so much time around the water in New York City, and so I'm curious what lessons you learned from other pier renovations. I know obviously yours isn't a pier anymore, but it is on the site of a pier. And then what lessons would you give to other projects that are happening on the water now? Because I think there's so much like rethinking of what we can do with waterfronts, especially with climate change. So like how do we reinvigorate these spaces for public use, but also realizing like these spaces are at risk?
So I've designed multiple piers in Hudson River Park. And as Charles pointed out, Little Island is not an island. It's not floating. It's on piles. It's on very tall piles to get it up out of the, and it's the first pier, but to be built after Hurricane Sandy. But there have been piers renovated in Hudson River Park since Sandy, but the cost to build a new structure that is higher. So a normal run-of-the-mill Hudson River Park pier costs about $50 million. And about 30 million of that is the piles and the conventional deck construction. And then there's a veneer on top of that that's much less costly. Hudson River Park doesn't have the money anymore. The state and the city funding has dried up. And so they're leaving the piers at the elevations that they are, which is 6.5, depending on where they are along the Esplanade. And so they are being designed as floodable. And one day they will be nuisance flooded, and one day they will be totally flooded. So I've also finished a pier recently on the east side that is kind of opposite Chinatown. And that 8-acre park, it's a big park, will also find itself nuisance flooding, tidal flooding, daily flooding, forever flooding. I mean, New York City, it's an incredible, this is like a mind-blowing concept. New York City has 525 miles of coastline, 125 of which are parkland. All of that parkland, at some point in the not-too-distant future, is not going to exist. Except for the bluffs on Staten Island. This is mind-blowing. And so, we talk about floodable parks. Well, fine. I can do floodable. But what about the next generation and the generation after that? So my lesson, I don't know what to say. We either build a wall around ourselves, and then we're not an island anymore because we can't see the goddamn water. And then what?
Yes, hi. So I'm an architect, so I'm going to ask a question about the project itself. So I've been living in basically Upper New England for the past 6 years. So I have a question about open public spaces in cold climates without enclosure, as is the case of Little Island. I just wonder how people use this place in the winter. Are there any coping mechanisms like maybe canopies or like heaters provided by the donors, or do people use this as much at all in the winter?
Believe me, the athletes, the joggers, the Stairmaster people, they're out there at all times, all of the year.
You know who you are. Yeah.
They're sort of the 6 a.m., park opens at 6 a.m. They're the 6 to 8 a.m. crowd. It is particularly cold on Little Island because of the wind. We actually set up our own weather station. So I have an app on my phone. I can tell you exactly the wind, the rainfall, and the heat index at all times. It's not that, people might a lot of people kind of shortcut through it. So they go up the access way, they're walking on the Esplanade, they shortcut and they walk through, and then they come out the other access way. So they just kind of do a spin through, and maybe they are checking out how cold it is. There is a spot, however, no, the donor is not providing gas heaters. There is a spot where I was there every single day during construction, and during the winter, all the time. And there's a spot where the sun comes that's protected from the north and the west. And it's just a little heat trap, and it's my little spot. And I have a stone there. There's a stone there. Anyway, yes, it's much less used in the winter, for sure.
What about the arts programs? It's are there still concerts and yoga events in the winter? The performances that I showed you, those are from May through September, so there's never any winter programming.
But the like yoga classes, yes, they go on. You know, as climate is changing, our winters aren't that cold anymore. Wind is an issue, but raw temperature, not so much.
So, Signe, you just rehearsed the kind of choreography of the site plan, I realize. You've embodied that, and you know where to find the thermal comfort. So over
I
here on
sure
the
have.
left.
Hi, quick question for you. That was a beautiful lecture. Thank you.
You're welcome. Thank you.
When you think about communal space, do you also think about intimate space and the difference between, say, parks in the US and parks in Europe?
Oh, I'm sorry, the question part was?
The question between communal space and intimate space.
Oh, communal and intimate. Yes. Oh, that is one of my absolute favorite topics. Because I really believe that a good space, whatever it is, a park or a public space or a paved space or whatever, has to be good for an individual and for a group. It has to make an individual feel comfortable as well as a group feel comfortable. There have to be places for that are sort of elastic, that can accept two different or three or four. I mean, if three people or whatever, it has to be elastic. So I'm a big believer in things that people can manipulate to make a space feel a bit like their own. I mean, I'm sure you've noticed this, but let's say there's movable chairs, right? And I see a chair here and I go, now I own this chair, right? This is now my chair because I moved it. I don't know, maybe it's facing the sun, maybe it's away from Charles. I don't know what it is. But it's that's the idea.
So it's Luxembourg Gardens or parks.
Yes. Yes. I was born next to the Luxembourg Gardens.
Thank you for such a wonderful presentation that was very thoughtful and thought-provoking. And the honesty was fantastic in so many ways. Thank you. At the start, when you were talking about the park, you introduced it as three things, nature, art, and culture. And you were kind of apologetic about that, saying it was kind of a strange thing. But as you spoke about the intense selection of plants and the species that it supports, I think that separation on such a small scale of park is actually quite important because you're cramming a lot in together, right? But on my one visit, the separation, all the handrails that keep the humans away from the non-humans would almost seem to support the non-humans, which you evidenced as vegetation, but all the wildlife that was being attracted. So I think that separation is really quite interesting in lots of different ways that you were expressing. In the second part of your lecture, when you're talking about the monuments and the challenges of the monuments, it occurred to me then, or my question is, do the monuments sit within any of those categories, or is part of the challenge that they kind of drift across over time, or that they can, one party puts them in one, part, another one, another? I'm just interested to hear your thoughts on that.
Let me just answer, or just explain maybe a little bit. So in order to get up to these extreme elevations in a short distance, and thank you for doing grading over there, we set them all at 8%. So that means there are always handrails. There's always handrails. So so it wasn't intentional to keep people out of the plant beds, but we needed the handrails, which then did the job. And it is interesting, and that's what I mean. Every year, I think, like, we had one pair of mallards. Now we've got 4 pairs of mallards. I think animals are getting the hang of it. All right, to your question about where do monuments fall in all of this? I think that's why I started with the image of Mount Auburn Cemetery. Again, sort of full disclosure, we're doing the master plan for Mount Auburn. And there's an excellent book written about the topic that really shares the history. But if you were, if you wanted, you could study the different visual, what's the word I'm looking, symbolism that is used on the different monuments at different eras of time, as well as what color stone was used at different times. So I would say that there's some definite artistry. There are definitely cultural expressions. And in many instances, of course, Mount Auburn itself is a level 3 arboretum. And a lot of people just go there. I mean, it's still, people go there to enjoy the park. And the monuments are almost like elements in the landscape. They don't look at it as, the permanent residence, as they're called.
Craig's been teaching in a core studio of cemetery landscapes for a couple of years, so you guys have some more to catch up on. We've got time for one more. Back right.
Hey, thank you so much for your lecture. I was just wondering if you could speak a bit more to the choreography, and you kind of showed us a little bit and spoke about ballet, and I was wondering how like that kind of movement influences circulation and design for you.
Absolutely, I have to demonstrate this now, right? I can't sit down and answer that question. Somebody was interviewing me about Little Island, and they really wanted me to focus on plants, like the blah, blah, blah. I said, no, the challenge was the grading. The topography set the whole, that was the toughest challenge and one of the greatest benefits. Because you can see the landscape on a slope. You can see swaths of landscape because it's on a, we have one-on-one slopes out there. But anyway, right, to the choreography. So here you are, or here I was, having to get you from elevation 16 to elevation 62 in a distance that I laid out. And I had to be sure that there was enough planting buffer that you weren't like walking right by somebody, or that you bump elbows or something like that. So we needed a certain buffer. And then there's inevitable switchbacks. So you're just like, oh God. And you're walking uphill the whole time at 8%, right? And so I thought to myself, well, what can I do here? So it was really about, like, whenever you come around a curve, you've got something in front of you, whether it's trees framing a view to the river or a view into the park or something. So at every turn, not necessarily the path length between the turns, but at the turns, the plants do something special in the foreground, and then the background does its thing, whether I control it or not, the borrowed scenery analogy. So that's the choreography part. Does that answer your question? And the wonderful thing is, we're all designers here. And ADA has been bludgeoned into us, and we think, oh God. But I just have to say that within a very short time, Little Island started to get published on a website that is that people who are in wheelchairs are connected to. And now you see people are able, on their own, without being pushed, to go up the hills. And of course, we have the proper landings and blah, blah, blah. And then, but what I forgot about is people with strollers. And there are so many people with strollers. That's the group that comes in from about 10 a.m. to, because the kids are screaming and they got to take a nap. And so they put them to sleep around all the curves from like 10 to 11:30. Anyway, it's wonderful. And people, who have maybe had foot surgery and have one of those wheelie things. So I really feel the importance of universal accessibility, watching the different people enjoy Little Island. And yeah, it's Makes me happy. Makes me happy.
Signe Nielsen, thanks so very much.